Sarah Martinez had always known she was different from other teachers. While her colleagues gathered in the faculty lounge discussing weekend plans and grading papers, she often found herself staring out the window, remembering a life that felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. The transition from military service to civilian life had been harder than any training she'd endured, but teaching seemed like the perfect way to serve her community in a new capacity. At 32, Sarah carried herself with a quiet confidence that her students noticed immediately. She wasn't tall or particularly imposing, standing at just 5'4", but there was something in her posture and the way her eyes seemed to take in everything around her that commanded respect.
Her dark hair was always pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she favored simple clothing that allowed her to move freely.
What her students and fellow teachers didn't know was that Sarah had spent 8 years as a Navy SEAL, one of the first women to complete the grueling training program. The decision to leave the military hadn't been easy. After multiple deployments and countless high-stakes missions, Sarah had reached a point where she wanted to build something rather than tear things down. Teaching high school mathematics seemed like the perfect opportunity to make a positive impact on young lives. She believed that education was just another form of service, another way to protect and strengthen her country. Lincoln High School was located in one of the city's more challenging neighborhoods. The building itself showed its age, with cracked paint on the walls and flickering fluorescent lights that cast harsh shadows in the hallways. Many of the students came from difficult backgrounds, dealing with poverty, family problems, and limited opportunities. Sarah had specifically requested to work at this school because she knew these kids needed someone who wouldn't give up on them. Her classroom was on the second floor, overlooking the school's small courtyard where students often gathered during lunch breaks. She had decorated the walls with motivational posters and mathematical concepts presented in colorful, engaging ways. Sarah believed that learning should be accessible and enjoyable, even for students who had previously struggled with academics. Marcus Thompson was one of those students who had earned a reputation that preceded him wherever he went. At 17, he stood 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighed nearly 200 pounds, most of it muscle from years of playing football before anger management issues got him kicked off the team. His disciplinary file was thick with reports of fights, verbal confrontations with teachers, and incidents of property destruction. Multiple teachers had requested that Marcus be removed from their classes, but the school's zero-tolerance policy meant that he needed to be given chances to succeed. Marcus had grown up in a household where violence was the primary method of resolving conflicts. His father had abandoned the family when Marcus was 12, leaving behind a legacy of anger and resentment that the teenager carried like a weight on his shoulders. His mother worked 2 jobs just to keep their small apartment, which meant Marcus spent most of his time unsupervised and angry at a world that seemed determined to keep him down.
The problems with authority figures had started early for Marcus.
Teachers represented everything he felt was wrong with the system. People who had power over him, who could dictate what he did and when he did it, who seemed to look down on him because of where he came from. By the time he reached high school, Marcus had developed a reputation as someone you didn't mess with, someone who would respond to any perceived slight with immediate and overwhelming aggression. When Sarah's class roster was handed to her at the beginning of the school year, several colleagues had pulled her aside to warn her about Marcus. They described him as dangerous, unpredictable, and beyond help. The principal, Mrs. Johnson, had even offered to have him transferred to another teacher's class, but Sarah had declined. She believed that every student deserved a fair chance and that her own experiences had prepared her to handle challenging situations. The first few weeks of school passed relatively smoothly. Marcus attended class sporadically, and when he was there, he usually sat in the back corner with his hood pulled up, earbuds in, completely disengaged from the lesson. Sarah didn't push him initially, focusing instead on establishing a positive classroom environment and building relationships with her other students. She had learned in the military that sometimes the best strategy was patience, waiting for the right moment to make your move. Sarah's teaching style was unlike anything most of her students had experienced before. She made math relevant by connecting equations to real-world situations that mattered to teenagers. When teaching probability, she used examples from sports and gaming. When covering geometry, she showed how architectural principles applied to the buildings around their neighborhood. Her enthusiasm for the subject was genuine and infectious, and gradually, students who had previously hated math began to show interest. Marcus noticed these changes in his classmates, though he pretended not to care. During one lesson on statistics, Sarah had used crime data from their own neighborhood to demonstrate how numbers could tell stories and reveal patterns. For just a moment, Marcus had found himself paying attention, curious despite himself about what the data revealed about his own community. The breakthrough moment came during the 4th week of school. Sarah had been explaining algebraic functions when she noticed Marcus actually taking notes. Instead of making a big deal about it, she simply continued with the lesson, but she made sure to include an example that built on something Marcus had written down. When class ended, she didn't call him out publicly, but she gave him a small nod of acknowledgement that he pretended not to see. That afternoon, Marcus stayed after school to walk home with some friends when he overheard two other teachers talking about Sarah in the hallway. They were discussing her unconventional methods and questioning whether someone so young and inexperienced should be working with such challenging students. One of them mentioned that they gave her 6 months before she either quit or had a complete breakdown. Something about their conversation bothered Marcus more than he expected. While he had no particular loyalty to Sarah, the dismissive way these teachers talked about her reminded him of how people often talked about him and his friends. It was the same condescending tone, the same assumption that people from certain backgrounds couldn't succeed or change.
The next day, Marcus actually participated in a class discussion for the first time.
It was minimal, just answering a direct question about a mathematical concept, but Sarah recognized it as progress. She didn't make a big deal about it, but she made sure to build on his contribution and show that his input was valuable to the class discussion. As the weeks progressed, other students began to notice that Marcus was slowly becoming more engaged. His attendance improved, and while he still maintained his tough exterior, there were moments when his genuine intelligence showed through. Sarah began to see glimpses of the person Marcus could become if given the right support and encouragement. The relationship between teacher and student was still fragile, built on mutual respect rather than trust. Sarah understood that Marcus was testing her, looking for signs that she would give up on him like so many others had before. She also recognized the anger that simmered just beneath the surface, the result of years of disappointment and betrayal by adults who were supposed to care about his future. What neither of them could have predicted was how quickly everything would change. The incident that would test both of them in ways they never imagined was still weeks away, but the foundation for what would happen was already being laid in these early interactions. Sarah's military training had taught her to read people and situations, to recognize potential threats before they became actual problems. But with Marcus, she saw potential rather than danger, possibility rather than inevitable conflict. The other students in the class had begun to form their own opinions about their new teacher. Some appreciated her patience and innovative teaching methods, while others remained skeptical about whether she could maintain order in a school known for its disciplinary challenges. Marcus represented the ultimate test case for Sarah's approach. If she could reach him, truly connect with him, and help him succeed, it would validate everything she believed about second chances and the power of education. As October arrived, Sarah felt cautiously optimistic about her progress with Marcus and her other students. The classroom environment had become more positive and productive, with students actively participating in discussions and showing genuine interest in learning. She had no way of knowing that her most difficult challenge was still ahead of her, or that everything she had learned in her previous life would soon be put to the ultimate test. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change both their lives forever. Though neither Sarah nor Marcus could have anticipated the events that would soon unfold in that second-floor classroom overlooking the school's quiet courtyard. The first signs of trouble began on a cold November morning when Marcus arrived at school already agitated. Sarah noticed immediately that something was different about his demeanor. Instead of his usual sullen but controlled presence, there was an electric tension radiating from him that made other students instinctively give him extra space. His jaw was clenched tight, his hands balled into fists, and his eyes held a dangerous glint that Sarah recognized from her military days as the look of someone on the edge of violence. The night before, Marcus had experienced one of the worst confrontations with his mother's boyfriend that he could remember. The man, who had been drinking heavily, had accused Marcus of being worthless and predicted that he would end up in prison like his father. The verbal abuse had escalated to the point where Marcus had seriously considered fighting back. But the knowledge that it would only make things worse for his mother had kept him from acting on his impulses. Instead, he had stormed out of the apartment and spent the night walking the streets, his anger building with each step. When Marcus entered Sarah's classroom that morning, she could sense the volatility in his movements. His backpack hit his desk with unnecessary force, and he slumped into his chair with an attitude that seemed to dare anyone to challenge him. Sarah made a mental note to keep an eye on the situation while she began her lesson on quadratic equations, hoping that the structure of mathematics might provide a calming influence. The lesson had been progressing normally for about 20 minutes when Sarah assigned a practice problem for the students to work on individually.
You were right there. You work $12.40. You said we just hopped on sale.
She noticed that Marcus wasn't even pretending to participate, instead staring out the window with his fist still clenched. Several other students kept glancing nervously in his direction, clearly sensing the same dangerous energy that Sarah had observed. Sarah made the decision to approach Marcus quietly, hoping to diffuse whatever was building inside him before it exploded. She walked over to his desk with the same calm confidence she had used when approaching potentially hostile situations during her military service. Her movement was deliberate but non-threatening, designed to show concern rather than confrontation. "Marcus," she said quietly, crouching down beside his desk so that their conversation wouldn't be overheard by the other students.
Is everything okay? You seem like you're having a rough day.
For a moment, Marcus didn't respond. Then he turned to look at her, and Sarah saw something in his eyes that made her instinctively assess the distance to the classroom door and the positions of the other students. There was a wildness there, a complete disconnection from rational thought that she had seen in combat situations when people were pushed beyond their breaking point. "You don't know anything about me," Marcus said, his voice low and menacing. "Don't pretend like you care." Sarah kept her voice steady and calm, drawing on techniques she had learned for de-escalating tense situations.
You're right. I don't know everything about your situation.
"But I can see that you're upset, and I want to help if I can. Sometimes talking about things can make them more manageable." The offer of help seemed to trigger something volatile in Marcus. Perhaps it was the memory of all the other adults who had promised to help and then disappeared from his life. Or maybe it was the contrast between Sarah's genuine concern and the cruel words his mother's boyfriend had hurled at him the night before. Whatever the reason, the careful control he had been maintaining suddenly snapped.
Help!
Marcus laughed bitterly, loud enough that other students looked up from their work. "Nobody helps people like me. You're just like all the rest of them, pretending to care until it gets too hard or too complicated." Sarah remained crouched beside his desk, maintaining eye contact while staying alert to his body language. She could see his muscles tensing, preparing for some kind of action, and she began running through possible responses in her mind. Her SEAL training had included extensive work on hand-to-hand combat and restraint techniques, but she hoped desperately that she wouldn't need to use any of those skills in her classroom. "That's not true, Marcus," she said, keeping her tone gentle but firm. "I'm not going anywhere. But right now, I can see that you're really angry about something, and I'm worried that you might do something you'll regret later." The mention of regret seemed to push Marcus over the edge completely. In his mind, Sarah's words confirmed what he had always believed, that adults saw him as a problem to be managed rather than a person worthy of respect. The accumulated pain and frustration of years of disappointment crystallized into pure rage, and rational thought abandoned him entirely. Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Sarah rose with him, maintaining the space between them, while positioning herself so that she could move quickly if necessary. The other students had stopped working completely, now sensing that something serious was about to happen. "Regret?" Marcus shouted, his voice echoing off the classroom walls. "The only thing I regret is listening to people like you tell me that things will get better if I just try harder, if I just follow the rules, if I just keep my mouth shut and take whatever garbage people want to dump on me." Sarah raised her hands slightly, palms facing Marcus in a gesture meant to be calming. "Marcus, I understand you're angry, but let's talk about this. Whatever happened, we can work through it together." The word "together" seemed to be the final trigger.
In Marcus's experience, together was just another lie that adults told before they inevitably abandoned him.
His vision narrowed until all he could see was Sarah standing in front of him, representing every authority figure who had ever let him down, every person who had ever made him feel small and powerless. Without warning, Marcus lunged forward, his hands reaching for Sarah's throat. His movement was fast and fueled by pure emotion, but it lacked the precision and technique that would have made it truly dangerous against someone with Sarah's training. Still, his size and strength meant that if he managed to get a solid grip on her, the situation could become life-threatening very quickly. Sarah's response was instantaneous and automatic. Years of military training kicked in without conscious thought, her body moving in ways that had been drilled into her through countless hours of practice. As Marcus's hands reached for her throat, she stepped slightly to the side, disrupting his balance while simultaneously raising her arms to block his attack. The movement was so smooth and natural that for a split second, Marcus didn't realize that his attack had been completely neutralized. He found himself off balance, his momentum carrying him forward while Sarah seemed to have simply disappeared from where he expected her to be. Confusion replaced rage for just a moment as his brain tried to process what had happened. Sarah had several options available to her in that instant. Her training included techniques that could have ended the confrontation immediately, putting Marcus on the ground and potentially causing serious injury. But despite the threat he posed, she saw him as a student first, a young person in crisis rather than an enemy to be defeated. Instead of following through with a devastating counterattack, she chose to create distance and try once more to de-escalate the situation. "Marcus, stop," she said firmly, backing toward the classroom door. Her voice carried a new authority that the students had never heard before, a tone that came from someone accustomed to being obeyed in life or death situations. "This isn't what you really want to do." But Marcus was beyond the reach of words now. The embarrassment of his failed attack, combined with the adrenaline flooding his system, only intensified his rage. He had crossed a line by putting his hands on a teacher, and some part of him understood that there would be serious consequences for his actions. Rather than backing down, he decided to fully commit to the path of violence he had started. He charged at Sarah again, this time with more focus and determination. His size advantage was significant, and he was confident that he could overpower her if he could just get his hands on her properly. What Marcus didn't understand was that he was no longer facing Sarah Martinez, the high school math teacher. The person standing in front of him now was someone who had been trained to handle much more dangerous opponents than an angry teenager. Sarah's second evasion was even more fluid than the first. Disappeared by time. "Does it seem like something simpler jested?" She sidestepped Marcus's charge and used his own momentum against him, guiding him toward the wall with a subtle push that sent him stumbling. The technique was called blending in martial arts, a way of redirecting an attacker's energy rather than meeting it head-on. The classroom had erupted into chaos as other students scrambled to get out of the way. Some had moved toward the door while others had pressed themselves against the far wall. "Do you be offended?" A few were recording the incident with their phones, though they were too shocked by what they were witnessing to think clearly about what they were doing. Marcus spun around from his collision with the wall, his face flushed with exertion and embarrassment. He had never encountered anyone who could move the way Sarah was moving, and his inability to land a solid hit was making him even more desperate and reckless. In his mind, this had become about more than just his anger from the previous night. It was now about his reputation and his sense of himself as someone to be feared and respected. "Stop running and fight me," he shouted, spittle flying from his mouth as he prepared for another attack. Sarah shook her head, maintaining her defensive posture while continuing to back toward the classroom door. "I'm not going to fight you, Marcus. You're my student, and I care about what happens to you. But I also can't let you hurt me or anyone else in this room." Her words might have reached the Marcus who had been slowly opening up to her over the past few weeks. But that person was completely buried under layers of rage and desperation now. He saw her continued evasion as mockery, her refusal to engage him directly as a sign that she didn't take him seriously as a threat. This time, when Marcus moved toward her,
It wasn't a wild charge, but a more calculated approach.
he had played football for years before his dismissal from the team, and he understood how to use his body as a weapon. He feinted to one side and then quickly shifted direction, hoping to catch Sarah off guard and finally get his hands around her throat. Sarah read his movement like a book. In combat situations, she had faced opponents who were not only larger and stronger than Marcus, but also professionally trained and armed with deadly weapons.
Doesn't they close to the parents and colleagues of the guide level so that they will be upset?
A teenage football player, no matter how angry or determined, simply couldn't match the level of threat she was prepared to handle. As Marcus closed in, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She had been holding back, trying to de-escalate and protect her student from the consequences of his actions. But his persistence and the escalating nature of his attacks meant that someone was going to get hurt if she didn't end this confrontation definitively. When Marcus reached for her throat again, Sarah didn't just evade. This time, she acted. The transformation in Sarah was instantaneous and complete. One moment she was a concerned teacher trying to help a troubled student, and the next, she had become something entirely different. Marcus's hand was inches from her throat when she moved with a speed and precision that seemed to defy physics. Her right hand shot up to intercept his wrist while her left hand struck a specific point on his forearm, causing his entire arm to go numb instantly. Marcus felt his hand stop moving as if it had hit an invisible wall. The numbness spreading up his arm was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Not painful, but completely disabling. Before he could process what was happening, Sarah had stepped inside his reach and positioned herself in a way that made it impossible for him to use his size advantage. Her next movement was a textbook example of close-quarters combat technique. Sarah's right hand moved to Marcus's shoulder while her left hand controlled his now useless arm.
With a pivot that used his own body weight against him, she guided him into a position where he was completely off balance and vulnerable.
The entire sequence had taken less than 3 seconds, and Marcus found himself in a situation where any movement he made would result in him being thrown to the ground with considerable force. But Sarah didn't throw him. Instead, she held him in that precarious position, demonstrating complete control while giving him a chance to understand what had just happened. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm and steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Marcus, I need you to stop now," she said quietly. Her words meant only for him. "I don't want to hurt you, but I can't let you hurt me, either. Do you understand what's happening here?" For the first time since the confrontation began, Marcus was completely still. The combination of physical restraint and the realization that he was dealing with someone far more dangerous than he had imagined had cut through his rage like a cold wind. He could feel the strength in Sarah's grip, the absolute certainty of her control over the situation. And something in his brain finally began to register that he was in serious trouble. The other students in the classroom were frozen in shock. They had expected to see their teacher either flee from Marcus's attack or become its victim. Instead, they were witnessing something that looked like it belonged in a movie rather than their math class. Several students had their phones out recording the incident, though they were too stunned to make much noise. Sarah maintained her position for a few more seconds, allowing Marcus to fully comprehend his situation before gradually releasing the pressure. She stepped back carefully, keeping her hands visible and non-threatening while remaining ready to act again if necessary. Her military training had taught her that the moments immediately following a physical confrontation were often the most dangerous.
As pride and embarrassment could drive people to make even worse decisions, then they could drive people to make even worse decisions.
Marcus stumbled backward, feeling returning to his arm as circulation resumed. He looked at Sarah with a mixture of confusion, fear, and lingering anger, trying to understand how a woman, half his size, had made him feel completely helpless.
Hey! Is it kind of like a traveling air saving, kind of like falling air saving, going outside, waiting to boy?
The rational part of his mind was beginning to reassert itself, and with it came the dawning realization of what he had just attempted to do. "How did you?" he started to ask, then stopped as the full weight of his actions hit him. He had attacked a teacher. He had tried to strangle someone who had been trying to help him. The consequences of what he had done began to cascade through his mind. Suspension, expulsion, possible criminal charges, the end of any chance he might have had to graduate. Sarah could see the exact moment when reality crashed back into Marcus's consciousness. His posture changed from aggressive to defeated, his shoulders slumping as the adrenaline began to fade and leave behind only the crushing weight of regret.
She had seen the same transformation in combat situations when the fog of battle lifted and people realized what they had done or nearly done.
"Marcus," she said gently, "I need you to sit down and take some deep breaths. Can you do that for me?" He nodded slowly, moving to his desk like a person in a dream. The other students remained frozen, unsure whether the danger had passed or if they were witnessing a temporary lull before another explosion.
Sarah looked around the room, taking in their frightened faces and the phones that were undoubtedly capturing everything for social media posterity.
"Everyone, please put your phones away," she said, her voice carrying the authority she had learned to project during her military service. "What happened here today is serious, and recording it isn't going to help anyone involved." Most of the students complied immediately, though she could see that some were reluctant to stop documenting what would undoubtedly become the most talked about incident in the school's recent history. Sarah made a mental note to speak with the principal about addressing the recordings later, but her immediate priority was managing the aftermath of the confrontation. Marcus sat at his desk with his head in his hands, the full magnitude of his situation becoming clearer with each passing moment. He could hear whispers from his classmates, could feel their stares, and knew that by the end of the day everyone in the school would know what had happened. More importantly, he knew that Sarah would have no choice but to report the incident, which would likely result in his expulsion and possible arrest. Sarah approached his desk again, but this time she was careful to maintain a respectful distance. The immediate physical threat had passed, but she understood that Marcus was still processing everything that had occurred and might react unpredictably to feeling cornered or threatened.
Marcus, I know you're probably feeling overwhelmed right now, she said quietly.
"What happened here was serious and there will be consequences. But I want you to know that I don't believe this is who you really are." He looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes, confusion evident on his face. "You should hate me," he said hoarsely. "I tried to hurt you. I would have hurt you if you hadn't. How did you do that? How did you stop me so easily?" Sarah glanced around the classroom, aware that their conversation was being overheard by dozens of students, who would repeat every word throughout the school. She made a decision that would later prove to be crucial for both their futures. "Class is dismissed early today," she announced to the room. "Please gather your things quietly and report to the library for a study period. Mrs. Henderson is expecting you." The students began to file out slowly, many of them casting backward glances at Marcus and Sarah. Several stopped as if they wanted to say something, but Sarah's expression made it clear that this was not the time for questions or comments. Within a few minutes, the classroom was empty except for Sarah and Marcus. With the audience gone, some of the tension left the room, though Marcus still sat with his head bowed, apparently lost in thought. Sarah pulled up a chair and sat down near his desk, close enough to talk privately but far enough away to avoid making him feel trapped. "To answer your question," she said finally, "I spent 8 years in the Navy SEALs before I became a teacher. What you saw today was my training taking over when I felt threatened." Marcus looked up sharply, his eyes wide with surprise. "You were a SEAL? Like a real Navy SEAL?" Sarah nodded. "It's not something I usually talk about with students. I came here because I wanted to focus on teaching, not on my military background. But sometimes the past has a way of catching up with us." The revelation seemed to shift something in Marcus's understanding of what had happened. He had attacked someone who was trained to handle much more dangerous situations than anything a high school could present. The fact that she had shown restraint, that she had controlled the situation without seriously injuring him, began to penetrate his consciousness. "You could have really hurt me, couldn't you?" he asked quietly. "Yes," Sarah replied honestly, "but that was never what I wanted to happen." "Marcus, I know you're dealing with a lot of anger and frustration. I could see it in you from the first day of school. What I don't understand is what happened today that pushed you over the edge." For a moment, it seemed like Marcus might not answer. Then, slowly, the story began to come out. He told her about his mother's boyfriend, about the verbal abuse from the night before, about feeling trapped in a life where violence and anger were the only responses anyone seemed to understand. As he talked, Sarah began to see the deeper pattern of pain and abandonment that had led to this moment.
"I've never had anyone fight back like that," Marcus admitted. "Usually when I get angry, people either run away or they try to get back at me later." "Nobody's ever just stopped me without trying to hurt me." Sarah leaned forward slightly. "Marcus, what you did today was wrong. There's no getting around that, and there will be consequences. But I also think this might be an opportunity for you to make some changes in your life."
He looked at her skeptically.
"What kind of changes?" "I attacked a teacher?"
"I'm probably going to jail,"
Maybe.
Sarah said honestly. "But that depends on a lot of factors, including how you handle what happens next. The Marcus I've been getting to know over the past few weeks, the one who's been participating in class and showing real intelligence, that's the person I believe you can be. Today's incident doesn't have to define your entire future." Marcus was quiet for a long time, processing everything that had happened and everything Sarah had said. Finally, he looked up at her with a mixture of hope and desperation. "What do I do now?"
He asked.
Sarah stood up and walked to her desk, pulling out a form that she had hoped never to have to use. "Now we report what happened to the administration, and we figure out how to move forward from here." "But Marcus, I want you to know something important." He looked at her expectantly. "I'm not giving up on you. What happened today doesn't change the fact that I believe you have potential. It just means we have more work to do." The promise in her words would prove to be a turning point, not just for Marcus, but for both of them, as they began to navigate the complicated aftermath of a moment that had changed everything. The next few hours unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of bureaucracy and damage control. Principal Johnson arrived at Sarah's classroom within minutes of her call, followed by the school security officer and, eventually, 2 police officers who had been summoned according to district policy for any incident involving violence against staff. Marcus sat quietly through it all, his earlier rage replaced by a hollow numbness as he watched his future seemingly dissolve before his eyes. Sarah's account of the incident was precise and factual, delivered with the same clarity she had once used in military debriefings. She described Marcus's emotional state when he arrived at school. What surprised everyone in the room was her recommendation that Marcus remain in school rather than face immediate expulsion. "I understand that what happened today was serious," Sarah told Principal Johnson during their private conference. "But I've been working with Marcus for several weeks now, and I've seen significant progress in his engagement and academic performance. I believe this incident was the result of external factors rather than his true character." "Do you see here Principal Johnson, a veteran administrator who had seen countless disciplinary cases over her 20-year career, was skeptical. "Miss Martinez, I appreciate your compassion, but this student physically attacked you. If we don't take strong action, it sends the message that violence against teachers is acceptable." Sarah nodded, understanding the principal's position while maintaining her own. "I'm not suggesting we ignore what happened or avoid consequences. but I am asking that we consider alternatives to expulsion that might actually help Marcus change his behavior, rather than simply removing him from our responsibility." The discussion continued for nearly an hour, with Sarah drawing on her military experience to present a detailed case for why Marcus deserved another chance. She outlined a specific plan that would include anger management, counseling, regular check-ins with school administrators, and a modified disciplinary schedule that would allow Marcus to continue his education while addressing the underlying issues that had led to the confrontation. Meanwhile, Marcus waited in the main office, accompanied by the police officers who would need to make a decision about whether to file criminal charges.
The social worker had been called to assess his situation and determine if there were safety concerns at home that needed to be addressed.
As the afternoon wore on, Marcus began to understand that his fate was being decided by people who barely knew him, based on a few minutes of violence that didn't represent who he wanted to be. When Sarah emerged from her meeting with the principal, she sought out Marcus in the office.
He looked up as she approached, his expression a mixture of hope and resignation. "What's going to happen to me?" he asked quietly. Sarah sat down next to him, aware that their conversation was being observed by school staff and police officers.
"That depends partly on you," she said.
"Principal Johnson is willing to consider alternatives to expulsion, but only if you're committed to making some real changes." Marcus looked at her with surprise. After everything that had happened, after he had attacked her and threatened her safety, she was still advocating for him. The concept was so foreign to his experience that he struggled to process it. "Why would you do that for me?" he asked. "Why would you stick up for someone who tried to hurt you?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Because I believe people can change if they're given the right support and motivation. Because I've seen what happens when we write off young people instead of investing in their potential. And because I think what happened today was about pain and frustration, not about who you really are." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Marcus's mother, who had been called to the school when the incident was reported. Linda Thompson was a woman in her early 40s who looked older than her years, worn down by the stress of raising a troubled teenager while working multiple jobs to make ends meet. She entered the office looking harried and afraid, clearly expecting the worst. "Marcus, what have you done now?" she said immediately, her voice carrying a mixture of anger and despair that spoke to years of similar conversations. Sarah stood and introduced herself, explaining her role as Marcus's teacher and her involvement in the day's events. As she described what had happened, she watched Linda's expression change from anger to shock to a kind of defeated resignation that broke Sarah's heart.
"I don't know what to do with him anymore," Linda admitted, tears starting to form in her eyes. "I've tried everything I can think of.
Counseling, discipline, talking to him, punishing him, nothing seems to work. He's been angry ever since his father left, and it just keeps getting worse." Sarah saw an opportunity to address not just Marcus's immediate situation, but also the family dynamics that had contributed to his problems.
Damaged by a second decimate.
She spent the next 20 minutes talking with Linda about resources available through the school district and community organizations that could provide support for both mother and son. The arrival of a representative from the district attorney's office added another layer of complexity to the situation. District policy required that all incidents involving violence against school personnel be reviewed for possible criminal prosecution, regardless of the preferences of the victim or the school administration. Sarah found herself in the unusual position of arguing against the prosecution of someone who had attacked her. She emphasized Marcus's age, the progress he had been making academically, and the potential for rehabilitation if he received appropriate support services. The prosecutor listened politely, but made it clear that the decision would ultimately be based on policy rather than Sarah's preferences. As the day wore on, a plan began to take shape. Marcus would face a 2-week suspension while a comprehensive evaluation was conducted by the school district's behavioral intervention team. During this time, he would be required to attend daily counseling sessions and complete his academic work through the district's alternative education program. Upon his return to school, he would be placed on a strict behavioral contract that would include regular meetings with Sarah, the school counselor, and his mother. The police officers, after consulting with their supervisors and the district attorney's office, decided to file a formal report but not to arrest Marcus immediately. Instead, they would recommend that he be placed in a youth intervention program that focused on anger management and conflict resolution. The criminal charges would be held in abeyance pending his successful completion of the program. Marcus listened to these arrangements with a mixture of relief and trepidation. He was grateful to avoid immediate expulsion or arrest, but he also understood that he was being given what amounted to a final chance. Any future incidents would likely result in much more serious consequences. As the school day ended and the various officials began to leave, Sarah found herself alone with Marcus and his mother. It was the first time since the morning's incident that they had been able to talk without an audience of administrators and law enforcement officers. "I want you both to understand something," Sarah said, addressing Marcus and Linda together. "What happened today was serious, and the next few weeks are going to be challenging. But this doesn't have to be the end of Marcus's education or his future."
Linda looked at Sarah with a mixture of gratitude and skepticism.
"Why are you helping us?" Most teachers would want him as far away as possible after something like this. Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. "Because I've seen what Marcus is capable of when he applies himself. Because I know that anger like his usually comes from pain, not from evil. And because I believe that giving up on young people is one of the worst things we can do as educators and as a society." Marcus, who had been quiet throughout most of the afternoon's proceedings, finally spoke up. "I'm sorry," he said, looking directly at Sarah. "I know sorry doesn't fix what I did, but I need you to know that I never wanted to really hurt you. I was just so angry, and I didn't know how else to deal with it." The apology was simple and direct, without excuses or attempts to minimize what had happened. Sarah recognized it as a genuine expression of remorse, the first step toward the kind of change that might make their continued relationship possible. But the real question now is what you're going to do differently going forward. Saying you're sorry is important, but changing your behavior is what will determine whether this incident was a turning point or just another step toward a future you don't want.
Over the following weeks, as Marcus served his suspension and began the counseling process, Sarah found herself reflecting on the incident and its aftermath.
She had come to teaching hoping to make a positive difference in young people's lives, but she had never expected to draw so directly on her military training. The confrontation with Marcus had been a reminder that the skills she had learned in the SEALs, situational awareness, de-escalation techniques, physical self-defense, were not just relics of her past, but tools that could serve her in unexpected ways. The response from her colleagues was mixed. Some praised her for maintaining her safety while showing compassion for a troubled student. Others questioned whether someone who had attacked a teacher should be allowed to remain in school at all. Sarah found herself defending her decision repeatedly, explaining her belief that education was sometimes about second chances and redemption rather than just punishment and exclusion. When Marcus returned to school 2 weeks later, he was a noticeably different person. The counseling sessions had given him tools for managing his anger, and the near loss of his educational opportunity had provided motivation to apply those tools. He approached Sarah before his first day back, asking if he could speak with her privately. "I know things can't go back to the way they were before," he said. "I know I broke your trust and probably scared you, but I want you to know that I'm going to do whatever it takes to prove that you are right to give me another chance." Sarah looked at this young man who had once seemed so threatening, and saw instead someone who was genuinely committed to change. "Marcus, trust is something that has to be rebuilt over time through consistent actions, but I'm willing to work with you if you're truly committed to becoming the person I know you can be." The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it did happen. Marcus threw himself into his academic work with an intensity that surprised everyone, including himself. He excelled not just in mathematics but in other subjects as well, discovering interests and abilities that had been buried under years of anger and acting out. His relationship with his mother improved as they both participated in family counseling sessions that addressed the underlying issues that had contributed to his behavioral problems. By the end of the school year, Marcus had become one of Sarah's most successful students. His grades had improved dramatically, his disciplinary problems had disappeared completely, and he had begun talking about college possibilities that had seemed impossible just months earlier. The incident that had nearly destroyed his future had instead become the catalyst for a complete transformation. Sarah, meanwhile, had gained a new understanding of the complexity of her role as an educator. She realized that teaching was sometimes about more than just academic content. It was about seeing potential in young people even when they couldn't see it in themselves, about providing second chances when everyone else was ready to give up, and about understanding that sometimes the most challenging students were the ones who needed the most support. The story of what happened in that classroom became a legend within the school, though the details grew more dramatic with each retelling. For Sarah and Marcus, however, it remained a private reminder of how quickly everything can change and how important it is to believe in the possibility of redemption even in the most unlikely circumstances. Years later, when Marcus graduated from college and returned to thank the teacher who had refused to give up on him, Sarah would reflect on that November morning and realize that sometimes the most important lessons happen outside the curriculum, in moments of crisis that test not just what we know, but who we choose to be.